Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining us. We have a good panel today. I think to start, obviously, the past 2.5 years have been a little different given COVID and everything, but I think the way we're looking at work is changing. And Janine, I'd like to start with you. What is something you've noticed about the road ahead for startups when it comes to hiring?
Well, I think the main headline is that when a founder is deciding where to put employees, the options are numerous and way more than ever before. That can both be a matter of too many choices or an abundance of choices based on the talent pool in the entire world. So it does pose challenges, but it's also a huge opportunity. And in some ways, it takes a bit of the stress off of someone who thinks the only way they can find talent is to compete here in the Bay Area. So it's a positive, but it doesn't mean that it's easy.
Yeah, I think I'd say hybrid's here to stay, right? I think the desire for workers to have flexibility in their work schedules and their locations is going to be a thing forevermore. One of the interesting things that we found on Gusto was that we saw a 240% increase in remote workers since 2021. I think the other piece is in a study we did where we talked to HR professionals and employees, 48% of them said that the ability to work from home some or all the time was going to be the key indicator in whether or not they decided to take a job. So, as we're thinking about the talent market, as we're thinking about being able to secure those difficult hires, being able to meet them where they are, both figuratively and literally, is going to be a key for any company looking to secure those hires.
Yeah, I think what we've seen, kind of what Emil says, like workers have power and they have sway, and individuals do want to work more flexibly. While I think at the same time acknowledging the last 2 years have not been particularly representative of what remote work usually looks like or what workers want. So I think that mass experiment is still kind of playing out, and yeah, we're going to see what's really going to emerge over the next probably 18 to 24 months.
Mm-hmm. Emil, you actually touched on my next question, and I'd love to start with you on this. There was a time when everyone wanted the ping pong tables, the kombucha on tap, the nap rooms, and now most people want flexibility and the ability to work from home, as you mentioned, as all three of you mentioned. What else is the demand out there now beyond those factors, beyond being able to work from my house or my bed? Like, what else are they looking for that have those similar perks to the kombucha on tap?
Yeah. I think more so than anything, the pandemic changed things, right? I think when you think about the ping pong tables, the kombucha on tap, like these were things that were built to keep you in the office for an elongated amount of time. I think what we've seen from home is that we can maintain that level of productivity and be better holistic humans, right? Speaking for myself, I have a wife and I get an opportunity to spend a lot more time with her, right? There are a lot of folks with kids who weren't able to see them grow up in the way that they are now. So as I think about, what is different, I think people want to be whole, right? People want to feel that connection to their work, but they also want to feel that connection to all the things that they enjoy and that they love outside of work. And I think that's what this flexibility has provided that companies really can't replicate.
I would add just a few more along those lines, which is that people do want to belong. And when they get that feeling from an employer and they're aligned behind the vision and the values of the company, that makes them feel really productive and really committed to the organization. So the question is not just, is it nice not to have to commute? It's what will replace the feeling of camaraderie and the feeling that I belong in this company? And I think employers have realized they do need to budget for things like travel so that people can get together and can spend time and bond. And so it's not just an indefinite, forever, never seeing colleagues. There's a new cadence, and I don't think we've settled into what that looks like, but I think it has to be part of work in the future for everyone to feel the commitment and be really ready to support the organization. So I think it's going to take time to see how that plays out.
Yeah, I think what workers want, and I've been fortunate to speak to a bunch over the last couple of years, is They want to stop sacrificing their quality of life for work and really have a higher quality of life. So I think when you think about what remote and flexible work are and aren't, it's not just a future of work evolution. It's like, how do we provide a quality of life revolution where people get to design the life that they live? And Emil's point about people missing their kids, for me it was, I missed my kids walking, laughing, talking for the first time. And I think that's really important to people, right? They don't have to be in an office 9 to 5, 5 days a week. There is still value to come together physically and spend time and build that skills for communication and collaboration. But like, who cares about a ping pong table? Who cares about an Xbox? Like, I think people care about doing great work. I think people care about having a really high quality of life. And then I think the extension of that, which I'm obviously going to be biased towards, is, do people have the right tools and equipment? And if you have the right tools and equipment, it's much easier to be productive. It's really hard to be in a 700 square foot apartment in San Francisco or New York and do your best work. So really being as safe, comfortable, and productive at home is really important, or wherever you work remotely. And then it's the other part, which is like, how do we maintain those skills of communication and collaboration so the work we do with our teams remains at a super high level?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and what I'd add to that is, 100% agree with Chris, tools and systems, and really committing and investing in this hybrid way of work if that's the path you decide to take. I think the other, innovative thing that I've seen that like Gusto's done is we hired a head of remote experience, and that person's sole responsibility is to bring that remote empathy to the table, right? I think it's really easy to forget that, things are different when you're in the office, right? And folks don't have the same levels of visibility. They don't have the same access to the water cooler conversations. So it's, how do you think about this holistically in a way that's not only going to be tools and systems, but it's going to be resources that are dedicated to it in the same way that we think about our workplace teams, right? When we were going into the office, there were a bunch of people on the workplace team that you run into, that you talk to every day. We have to think about that in a virtual setting as well in order to create that equitable experience.
I think for me personally, I would only do hybrid or remote. I would never go back into the office. That's a deal breaker for me. TechCrunch is probably listening and they know that. But I think my question, and Chris, you kind of touched on this, so I'm curious if you could dive further into it. How can companies meet talent where they are when they have so many options and requirements or these deal breakers, especially today?
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head, right? It's about organizations and how can we meet people where they are? How can we deliver the things that they require from us as a company? But equally, like the other side is their personal side. And I think there's ways to design that. You just said, like, look, there's no way I would ever go back to an office full time. And I think that's a reaction generally of like people, right? Like the stats are 90% plus of people never want to go back to an office again full time. Less than 10% do want to go back to an office full time. So there's a huge proportion of people who do want that flexibility. And I think then when you double click into that, there's just a lot of variance across the board, right? Engineers maybe want to go into an office less. People in media, marketing, sales want to come into the office more. So I don't think there's any like catch-all answer to that, which is like specific to a company. I think it's having that flexibility inside the organization to design your work systems to what the individual requires. And I think companies that do that, we work with a bunch of companies who basically say like, look, you choose. If your quality of work's high, you're producing, the outcomes are good, we're gonna have less of a problem with that. And I think like that's just a personal management thing. I think there's a tweak happening, which is like, rather than this command and control type leadership, which I guess has historically been the way things are, there's more empathy involved, right? Like maybe you have to pick your kids up. Maybe somebody has a health condition or impairment that finds it really difficult to work in an office. Maybe they're caring for a family member. So I think just where you started, meeting people where they are, giving them what they want, I think that's the key here, really.
We recently surveyed a subset of our portfolio companies, and of those that replied, which was a range from seed to growth stage, about 43% have some sort of hybrid scenario where employees are working 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 days in the office. So there are still companies that maybe because of their setup before the pandemic, really want to bring people together at least one day per week. So it's not gone. I agree that things have shifted in a way that's probably irreversible, but it doesn't mean that there are going to be companies that feel more successful if everyone's together.
Yeah, and personally, I enjoy going to the office when I can. I usually go about once or twice a week. It just feels good to get out of the house. I think I was in my apartment for so long during the pandemic that I'll take any opportunity to leave it. I think when it comes to meeting talent where they are, I think the first thing that we all can do is just listen to them, right? As we're thinking about our brand, as we're thinking about our value proposition, as we're thinking about the talent that we want to engage and attract, we got to listen to what they're looking for, right? We got to listen to our employees and then build around that. And I think the best way you can do that is by building equitable experiences. You know, like we've touched on, some folks want to come into the office 5 days a week. Some folks don't want to come in at all. So how do you create experiences that are going to allow them to be highly productive and highly engaged, no matter what their situation is? I think there's an aversion to this because this is much different, right? It's much easier to build for a monolith. But as things have shifted, I think what we've seen is that, you know, companies that can provide that flexibility, that don't have a one-size-fits-all approach, are not only going to be the companies that successfully hire new folks, but those are going to be the companies that retain talent, which I'd argue is equally as important given how high stakes hiring is today.
I'm glad you brought up the point of retaining talent because it's already hard enough to get certain hires. And once you do, what would be your advice to all three of you on how to keep that talent from leaving within 6 to 12 months because they're unhappy?
Well, I think I'll talk about the portfolio companies that we recently surveyed on that very point. They are very intentional about finding opportunities for employees to come together, to collaborate, to feel like they're part of something. And I think it's very isolating. Yes, we've been in our houses, apartments for the last couple years, and when you work in isolation, you do begin to feel really disconnected. You begin to withdraw and not have the commitment maybe to the organization because we're really attached to people. And that's why if your organization is hybrid, you do need to create opportunities for people to come together, even if it's in a relatively local hub type scenario. I know that there's a range of people that work in startups. Not everybody has a family that they're missing out on. A lot of them are early in their lives and are wanting to connect and make friends and be with other people. So I strongly advocate for finding opportunities and budgeting for opportunities for time together.
Yeah, I think for me, in being in the role that I'm in, I mean, it starts at that first phone call, right? It's, you know, how are we talking about the opportunity? How are we creating a process that's going to allow folks to understand what it's actually like to work at a company? You know, one of the biggest pet peeves that I have as I look across the industry is seeing companies just copy and paste a process or copy and paste a mindset from the company to the left or the company to the right of them, right? That's not going to get you the success that you're hopeful for, right? So I think the better that you can do in curating what your experience looks like, how accurate of a depiction that you're giving folks into what it's like to work at a company, you can set yourself and that candidate up for success 3, 6, 12 months down the line. And kind of thinking about hybrid, you know, I think one of the things that comes to mind to me is, you know, we kind of talked about commuting a little bit earlier. As we talk about the different circumstances of folks, we're seeing more Americans with disabilities gainfully employed than ever, right? Because they're able to overcome what's been a huge barrier for them and for a lot of folks, which is commute, right? I think as we understand the shifts of metropolitan areas and how much more difficult it's becoming to commute via car, via train, via, you know, whatever your vessel of transportation is, these are providing real opportunities to folks who have been historically excluded, which I think is something that can go overlooked, and it's something that I'm really, really bullish on in terms of how we think about representation and how we better serve underserved communities.
Purpose matters. I think that's like the place I would start, where people don't want to work for a business that is just ruthlessly exploiting things. So I think like people who care about the mission, like that seems like cliche, but actually I think it's true. So that's number one. Number two, like I'll maybe rock the boat a little bit here. I think there's a lot of like media talk right now about, well, remote workers are more loosely tied to the organization. I think companies are finding out right now how loosely people are tied when they demand people to go back to the office. So I think that's been something that's playing out in real time. I think big companies are realizing that like when you're in a knowledge economy, the talent that you have matters, and the talent that you have relative to your competitors matters. And if you don't have the most talented people in the market, it's incredibly difficult to create the products and services and solutions that you need to as a startup. I think the final thing is like startups are hard. And I think like you need people who understand how hard they are. It's not like a typical 9-to-5 job in some large tech bureaucratic business where you can just clock in and clock out. Like there is a lot to working in a startup, which I think people should be prepared for. It's not as straightforward or linear.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think to Chris's point, like I think what he's getting at is like really finding that talent market fit, right? Mm-hmm. Being able to understand your secret sauce and being able to build processes and experiences around that. I think as you're thinking about, startups, and as we think about the difficulty that comes with hiring nowadays, right? Startups are in a prime position to be able to leverage impact, to be able to leverage growth and developmental opportunities, to be able to leverage trajectory, right? And opportunities to see things that you won't see at a traditionally large company. So I think, this might be against the grain a little bit, right? But now I think it's the opportunity for startups and smaller companies to really, find their lane and start to go all in on it. Because I think, again, there is a lot of folks who are looking for the opportunities that the people in this room have to offer. We just got to make sure that we're creating the narratives and packaging up in a way that's going to be easily digestible and attractive.
Okay. And before we move on to my last question, I just want to remind the audience that we're doing Q&A as well. So there should be a QR code and you could submit questions there, and then I'll scroll through and pick out some of the best. But my last question for you three is, I have a founder friend who told me when he was trying to hire, there was a candidate they really wanted, but in the end they went up and went with the company from like Fang or Mang or whatever you guys want to call it. How do you advise startups to make a meaningful offer in a way that they are competitive against these massive corporations when it's not just money? Because obviously some of these bigger companies can toss more at candidates than perhaps a startup can. What would you advise them in that situation?
So it can be very self-selecting. If someone really is seeking the safety of a Fang or Mang company, then you got to ask yourself, why did we go so far down the path if that was the safety that they're looking for? You need somebody who's willing to lock arms with you and be your partner, and so that's definitely something to suss out early. And I think, though, what I've seen in the last year and a half are founders that go that extra mile to personalize, reach out, and two founders that I can think of, even though it was during the pandemic and people were really not doing a lot of in-person meetings, they flew to the person's location where they were going to start working in Ohio and met with them and did a walk and just showed and demonstrated how important it was to connect in person, to have that kind of in-person experience. And it resulted in someone who had multiple offers deciding to go with this founder because they're accepting the opportunity to work with a founder, not a company per se. So there's a big distinction, and I think the personalization is really critical to really get through to what really matters.
Yeah, I actually think it's probably a good thing. If you get the last two and they're like, yeah, I'm going to go to Fang or Mang business, like it's a bit of an anti-pattern. Like you should probably have qualified them out earlier if they're deciding on that. And I think for startups, like you need people that want to own things, right? You need people that are willing, capable, and able to drive things forward. And if you want to go and optimize where a button's positioned and the color of a button is, like by all means, and you're going to get paid, you're going to get compensated incredibly well. But are you going to be successful in a startup where a lot is expected of you? Probably not, and I'm sure you probably give similar advice to the portfolio.
Yeah, I think one of the things that Gusto does in order to really get to the core of what makes someone tick is we do a values and motivation alignment interview, which is a little bit of a departure from like the core technical interview that you might have an engineer go through. And what it's aimed at is attempting to create resonant messaging, to create connection, and to better understand what makes someone tick. Right? It really gives us an opportunity to talk about the realities, the ins and outs of being a Gusty or a part of a fast-growing startup. And I think in those conversations, you really get an opportunity to get to the heart of what someone is looking for. And I think in those conversations, you might come to the conclusion that someone's looking for safety, right? Someone wants to go change the color of a button, which is not a bad thing whatsoever, right? But I think, to what Chris was saying, if you want to be a part of a fast-growing startup, right, you have to be willing to go all in and lock arms and really do whatever it takes to see the next day, because nothing is guaranteed. So I think, as you're thinking about founders and what they can do to be a part of the process, I would say it's two things. The first of which is, really be a part of defining those North Stars early and often. Like I said earlier, for us, it's skill set. Are you bringing something additive? Motivations. Are you motivated by the pain points that we're trying to solve as a customer, as a company? Excuse me. And then values, right? Do you see the world in the way that we see it? Do you see the plight of small businesses being a great opportunity for us to help empower a world that where work empowers a better life? And I would say the second thing is, and this is kind of a self-serving statement, really build in a recruiting ethos into your company. Right? If we're to make the assumption that product and people are the two biggest variables in whether or not a company is going to succeed or not, it's one thing to put all your time in product, but you have to be thinking about the ethos of the company as recruiters. Are we referring folks? Are we putting together really thoughtful and curated interview experiences? Are we showing up on time? Are we doing the small things that over time really scale and create an employer value proposition that's going to scale and that's going to attract people much more easily than in the past? So there are a lot of things that founders can do, but those are the two things that come to mind.
I just want to add, because recruiting sounds like, it's critical. We can't emphasize enough to founders that for seed and Series A, they should be spending 70% of their time recruiting. So yes, product and people, but at that early stage when you're building, that's pretty much most of your time. When the company gets a little bit later stage and there are people, then really we're looking at 50 to 60%. It doesn't go down that much. And it's just such a critical part of company building.
Great. One of the questions I got from the audience was, when looking to hire internationally, which countries or cities stand out for their quality of skilled mid to top tier tech talent?
Good question.
Jeannie, do you have any thoughts perhaps on your portfolio companies or?
So it so depends, really. We have invested a lot in Europe, and we have talent colleagues in Europe that have done various landscapes to figure out, where should you put engineers? Where should you put go-to-market people? And really there's a different answer. And because there are so many languages and cultures, it's not easy to build a company that is split apart in that early stage. So I hear about Spain being a good place. I hear about Poland being a good place for engineers. Tel Aviv is a great place for engineers. A lot of it just depends.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think we've kind of done the opposite, which is like we haven't focused on specific geos. We've just kind of said, who's the best person, who has worker company fit, and like who's going to be great in our program, and just hiring them where they are. Like we mentioned earlier about like meeting people where they're at. I don't really care where someone is. If they're the person that can make the biggest impact on the company and they're in Portugal, Spain, Poland, Canada, South America, India, we just need to find a way to make it happen. And some of those geographies are harder than others just from a legal standpoint. But ultimately, like the thing that's going to predicate our success is, can we hire the highest caliber of people possible wherever they are?
Yeah, my answer would be somewhere in between these two, right? I think there's meeting people where they are, right? And being really intentional around your talent strategy as you think about these different markets. I think at a company like Gusto or any slightly larger company, you have to worry about the legalities, the security risks. So there's a lot that goes into where you hire folks, but I guess all I'd say is just be intentional, right? And ensure that, as you're expanding internationally, that it's still going to be in alignment with your company culture, your company values, and that you're not seeing any separation of the two, because once the cat's out the bag, it's hard to get it back in. So that's what I would implore.
Great. And then another question was, what are organizations doing to compete for talent in terms of comp and total rewards while maintaining internal equity with existing employees?
Well, we recently surveyed our portfolio companies, and we did ask, are you making any compensation changes, either equity or cash? And the majority said no change right now. And there are normal practices around equity refresh that comes after a certain vesting period. So those are still in place. What I'm seeing as a big spike are benefits related to wellness and mental health increasing across portfolio companies regardless of the size. So that's a cost to the company, and it's a benefit to the employee. So that I've seen just over the last 2 years go up incredibly high.
Yeah, I think we've kind of seen a refocusing of the IC on cash versus executives who are more willing to lean towards equity as the overall total package. And I think that's been like a subtle shift across the last 3 to 6 months, where that hasn't historically been true, certainly going to be true on the go-forward basis. I think like there's maybe a more interesting question to ask, which would be, what is happening to people whose equity is priced here, and they're possibly going to raise new rounds where equity isn't going to be here? And I think like answering that question across the portfolio might be a much harder question.
We did ask.
Okay.
And so I think not one of the companies that we surveyed is experiencing lower valuation. Many are early stage, and they're talking about the future. And so that's, I know, obviously I don't have my head in the sand. There's a whole market out there and macro conditions that are pretty volatile. And I'm sure that there are some challenging situations.
I think it's a question sophisticated people coming into business are going to ask, right? Like where is the 409A?
Yeah.
Where do you expect it to be? What is the next round going to look like?
And that is actually a great point, because when it comes to hiring executives now, there's a lot more due diligence on the part of executives joining a company.
They know
want
ask the
deeper
right
dive
questions,
into financials. They have a lot more questions. They are less enamored with the story, although the story is always important. So I would not take away the particular story. Most of the time, the executive is looking to join the founder, but there's a lot more sharing of information.
Yeah, I think what I'd say is, no company has a 100% offer accept rate, to my knowledge, right? So there's really no silver bullets here. But as it comes to comp, right, I think, one of the things that we're seeing in this volatile market is, whatever your comp philosophy is, it has to be aligned with, your long-term business model, right? I think what we've seen is companies go or get beyond their skis to a certain degree in paying these numbers that, as things shift with the market, they're no longer able to maintain, which I think is why we see a lot of what we've seen. So I think it's important, right, to really think about the holistic offer that you're providing, wellness benefits, perks, things that matter to the individual. But I also think it's really, really important to remain smart and think about the long game, because again, we see these cycles come and go, right? But at the end of the day, your responsibility as a founder, as an executive of a company, is to ensure that you have a durable business model and that the numbers are going to support it. So when you're getting asked those questions about the 409As and the back-end financials, you can actually tell a story that's going to work well with your founding story and the mission and why you're here.
Great. Another question we got was, if you are not getting the applicants you are looking for, how do you attract the right talent, and where do you recommend startups to look?
Yeah, I mean, I can kick this off at a high level, right? And we talked about it a little bit earlier, but expand the geographies in which you're looking at. We've been able to see a lot of success in getting away from the primary markets where our home bases are. We've been able to hire great talent across the United States and Canada, both junior and senior. So I would say that's the first thing. The second thing is contractor hiring, right? I think what's important is that the work gets done and that you have this always-on kind of workforce that's readily available to you. On Gusto, we've seen a 64% surge in contractor hiring over the last couple of years. So we're seeing folks use the contingent workforce model a little bit more than they ever have, and I think it has to do something with the fact that it's harder to hire FTEs than ever.
Yeah, I think just because you love your startup doesn't mean that other people know who you are. Like people aren't just going to turn up on your doorstep on day one who are incredibly talented, breaking the door down to work for you. So there's definitely like a huge element of being proactive. Janine's point on like, if you're not spending 70% of your time on talent, you're probably wasting your time. I think there is no bigger impact that a founding team can have in a business is like being laser focused on the people that you need to find. So yeah, you can be proactive on Twitter, you can use LinkedIn, you can use other sites. I think if you're not going to source and targeting the people that you know are going to be successful in your program, I think that's where you should spend most of your time. I think it's the easiest win while still being incredibly hard.
So just expect it to be really hard. It reminds me of a story. One of the companies Sequoia invests in is Loom, and Joe Thomas, the founder, created Loom videos of himself pitching a IC engineer, telling them why Joe liked the background, why they think they would be a fit at Loom, and it was incredibly personal, sent directly to the engineer. I mean, it was impossible for that person not to reply. So, I mean, think about how, as an IC, you're receiving a founder really customizing the reach out. So, yes, it's really hard, but if you personalize it and really point out what you really like about that potential candidate, I mean, I think it makes a difference. And that is not super scalable, is it? But you will build your company brick by brick if you are that careful and that diligent about reach out, and that's why it adds up to 70% of your time.
Going off of that, Janine, another question related to that is how much time should founders spend looking for talent? Should that be a part of their focus? And perhaps maybe that would change from an early stage company to later.
A lot of times seed, I mean, there is no recruiter. There's the founder. The founder is the recruiter. And even Series A, sometimes still the main recruiter is the founder. So, I mean, spending as much time as possible, leveraging your network. It's just really hard work. And each hire that you make can unlock a new network. I think it just takes a lot of time. I don't think there's any way around it.
Yeah, I mean, to quantify it, probably 35 hours a week, minimum.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think it never changes, right? Like to Janine's point, like in seed, you've got to do it. In Series A, maybe there's someone that can take some of the weight off your shoulders, but you're always going to be the key recruiter in exec hires, usually in senior management hires, and that never gets easier. I think like maybe you become more focused on the people who are great for the program, and that becomes more and more obvious. But if you sort of skimp on the amount of time that you spend on it, like you get the result that comes as a consequence.
Yeah, and what I'd say is Chris is not lying. I was talking to him backstage. He was telling me about the calls he had this morning. So he's always recruiting. But I think the important thing is, as you're thinking about scaling, as you go from being that one recruiter to maybe now you have one person or a team doing it, it's really, really important that your fingerprints as a founder are still all over that hiring process, and that you're building a platform and a brand as a founder that continually allows you to be a recruiter, even if it's not you on LinkedIn, even if it's not you on the phones anymore. But to kind of bring everything that we've talked about together, founders are the biggest recruiters at a company, right? They are the thing that draws folks to a company. And the bigger of a platform that you can create, both directly and indirectly, the better your company is going to have at being able to get that talent.
Great. My last question that I want to ask you guys from the audience was obviously, and I'm kind of paraphrasing it, but obviously where we are today, there are different requirements or things that talent might want. And we've discussed things from like work from home, hybrid, or a lot of different scenarios. Where do you see hiring going forward, and what are some of the best strategies that you would recommend to startups?
I mean, I can start.
Please.
I see hiring kind of continuing this trend, like I said earlier. Hybrid's here to stay, right? Flexibility is going to be a desire forever more. So look at internally at Gusto, 47% of our workforce elected to go fully remote. And 30% of our most senior leadership team elected to go fully remote too, right? So this isn't just one side of the coin that wants this flexibility, it's everyone, right? So as I think about the future of recruiting, the future of hiring, I think it's going to continually be being very, very intentional around the experiences that you're creating, being really, really equitable in the experience that your employees feel. I think one of the things that we do that I'm really, really proud of is, as we're thinking about job applications, something that can be seen as really, really simple and just a culmination of words. We do our best to use gender-neutral language. We allow candidates to phonetically pronounce their names into our platform so that we can address them in the way that they want to be addressed. We let them pick their pronouns, right? So, as you're thinking about building a talent brand, as you're thinking about doing the small things that can make a difference at the end of the process, when they're considering your startup versus a FANG or a main company, like these are the things that come to mind. And I can say this personally, given that I came to Gusto during the pandemic. And once you stripped away all the ping pong tables and the happy hours and stuff like that, what mattered the most to me was the experience that I had, the connection that I had with the people, and the mission that the company was trying to make good on. And when you put those three things together and every candidate feels how special that can be when all three come together in a great way, you put forth a value proposition that's hard to turn down.
That was a great answer. I love that.
+1.
So I think that really being creative about the way that you present your company brand, even when you think about what qualifications are, it's important to really look at things that are more inclusive and that are less strict and structured the way maybe you recruited in the past. We've definitely seen our companies bring in tremendous best practices as it relates to hiring a more diverse workforce. And the pandemic has really driven that. Both the need for talent and the realization that just doing things the old way not only didn't make sense, but didn't result in better hires. So I think that when we hear from our companies around what keeps them up at night, it does include attracting a very diverse workforce. And that's heartening because that's probably not the answer we would have gotten 4 years ago.
Right. Chris, 15 seconds. What do you have to say?
Stop thinking about the future of work. Start thinking about the future of living. And as a consequence of that, you will be able to hire better people because you'll give them what they want.
Beautiful. Thank you. Thank you, Chris, Janine, and Emil, for joining me on stage. And thank you, everyone else, for listening in.